I fed 6 of their children with my body. 6 children. 11 years. The milk that my body produced after the death of my own son was taken from me and given to them with the same casual authority that everything was taken from me and given to wherever it was needed. I did not choose this. I did not offer it. I was assigned to it the way a tool is assigned to a task, because the task existed and I was the available instrument, and the question of what the instrument preferred was not a question anyone in that house was in the habit of asking. But here is what they did not understand about what they had done. They had put me in the most intimate possible position with their children, more intimate than the mothers themselves, who nursed briefly or not at all and then handed the children to me and returned to the social obligations that the running of a Richmond household required. More intimate than the fathers, who visited the nursery with the periodic attention of men who considered child-rearing a department of domestic life that operated better without their direct involvement. More intimate than anyone. They had given me their children's first experiences of the world. What the first experience of the world is what the world is. I decided what their children's first experience of the world would be, and I decided it with the full understanding of what I was doing, and why and what it would produce in the people I was raising, in the fullness of time, in ways that the people who had put me in that nursery would not see coming until it was too late to go back to the beginning and make a different choice. My name is Naomi. I am 41 years old. I have spent 23 years in the service of the Carver family of Richmond, Virginia, in the large house on Grace Street that Edmund Carver built in 1842 with the profits of the tobacco trading firm that his father had established in 1815, and that Edmund had expanded into one of the 3 most significant tobacco operations in the city. I came to that house at 18. I have been in it for 23 years. I know every room and every person in it, and every secret that a house accumulates across decades of births and deaths and marriages, and the particular griefs and failures that families generate when they live close together across time. I know them better than they know themselves. This is not a boast. It is the specific result of being the person in the room whom no one watches, because everyone has already decided what you are, and what you are does not require watching. It is the result of 23 years of being present in every room of a house whose inhabitants have never considered that the woman in the corner might be paying attention. I have been paying attention since the first day, but I am starting in the middle of the story when I should be starting at the beginning. Let me start at the beginning. Let me tell you about my son first, because my son is the reason for everything that came after, and everything that came after deserves to be understood in the context of what preceded it. His name was Samuel. He was born in November of 1848, 6 years after I came to the Carver house. His father was a man named Thomas, who worked as a carpenter in the city, a free man whose freedom had been purchased by his own labor over 10 years of extraordinary discipline, and who had found me through the network of connections that existed between the enslaved community of Richmond's households and the free black community that moved alongside it. We were not married in the legal sense because I was enslaved and the law did not recognize my capacity to enter contracts, including the contract of marriage. We were married in the sense that mattered, which is the sense that 2 people recognize in each other and commit to regardless of what the law says about it. Thomas came to the Carver house on Sundays when Edmund Carver permitted it, which he did, because permitting it cost him nothing, and because a content house slave was a more productive house slave, and because the fiction that he was a benevolent master required occasional gestures of the kind that benevolence was supposed to produce. Samuel was born on a Sunday morning in November, when the frost had come early, and the city outside the window of the small room where I labored was quiet with the particular quiet of a cold morning when most people are still inside. He was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I want to say that plainly, and without the apology that the circumstances of my life might suggest I should attach to it. He was beautiful. He was healthy and complete, and absolutely himself from the first moment, with Thomas's eyes and my mother's mouth, and a quality of attention in his face that I recognized immediately as the attention of someone who was going to pay close attention to the world he was in. He lived for 4 months. The fever that took him came in March and moved through him in 3 days and left on the morning of the 4th day without him. I held him through all of it, in the way that you hold something you cannot save but cannot put down. I held him, and I felt him go, and I sat with him for a long time after he was gone, until Bertha, who was the senior housewoman and who had seen this before, came and sat with me and eventually took him from my arms with the gentleness of someone who understood that what she was taking was everything. Thomas came the following Sunday. We sat together and we did not speak for a long time. Then he took my hands and held them and said something that I have carried since, that I will carry until the day I am done carrying things. He said that Samuel had been with us for 4 months, and that 4 months was not nothing. That 4 months of being loved completely was not nothing. That Samuel had known, in whatever way a child 4 months old knows things, that he was loved without condition or limit or reservation, and that this was not nothing, and that we would carry it for both of us since he could not carry it himself. I carry it still. 3 weeks after Samuel died, Mrs. Augusta Carver came to me and told me that her youngest child, a boy named William who had been born 6 weeks before Samuel, was not thriving on the wet nurse who had been assigned to him, and that she needed me to take over. She said this with the tone of a woman delivering a work assignment. She said it without acknowledging that I had just buried my son. She said it without looking at my face, which was a face that any person willing to look at it could have read clearly. I said, "Yes, Mum." And I went to the nursery and I picked up William Carver and I fed him with the milk my body was still producing for a child who was no longer there to receive it. And I looked at his face while I fed him. And I made a decision. Not in the way that decisions are usually made, with deliberation and consideration of alternatives and the weighing of costs. This decision arrived complete, the way some truths arrive, already fully formed, requiring only recognition rather than construction. It was not a decision so much as an understanding of what I was going to do with the position I had been placed in without my consent, and the access it gave me, and the years of intimate influence it represented. I was going to raise their children. I was going to raise them completely and carefully, and with the full application of everything I knew, and everything I had learned, and everything I understood about the world and about the people in that house, and about the specific nature of what had been done to me and to everyone I loved by the system that house represented. I was going to raise their children to see it, not to hate their parents in the simple sense that the word hate usually carries, the hot immediate emotion that burns itself out and leaves nothing permanent. I was going to raise them to see their parents, to see them clearly, without the protective distortion that children raised in comfort usually develop around the people who provide that comfort. To see the gap between what those people said they were and what they actually were, between the version of themselves they presented to their children and the version that I had watched for years from the corner of every room. I was going to raise them with the particular quality of vision that comes from being told the truth about the world from the beginning, before the comfortable lies have had time to establish themselves as the truth. I was going to raise them with their eyes open, and I was going to do this so slowly and so quietly and with such complete deniability that by the time anyone noticed what had happened, the children would be grown and the seeing would be permanent, and there would be nothing left to do about it. William Carver was the first. He came to me at 6 weeks old, and I held him and fed him, and I began. What I began was a practice of truth-telling so subtle that it was indistinguishable to anyone who might have been watching, from the ordinary talk that a woman does with a child too young to understand language, the sounds and the rhythms and the particular tone of voice that research says children absorb before they understand the words. I spoke to William in that tone. I told him things, not in language he could yet process, but in the pattern and the feeling, and the quality of what language carries beneath its surface, the emotional content that children receive before they receive the words. I told him that the world was not what he was going to be told it was. I told him that the people who would tell him the world was one way had reasons for telling him that which were not about his understanding of the world, but about their comfort within it. I told him that the woman holding him had a son who had died, and that she was holding him with the love she had for that son, and that the love was real, and that what had produced the need for her to hold him instead of her own son was not natural or inevitable, but chosen and constructed and maintained by people who benefited from the construction. He was 6 weeks old. He could not understand a word. But words I had come to understand across years of paying attention to things that most people did not pay attention to are not only their meaning, they are their temperature, their weight, their rhythm, the emotional world they carry around their meaning like water around a stone. And the emotional world I was transmitting to William Carver, 6 weeks old in my arms, was the emotional world of truth, the particular quality of reality that comes from a person who is not pretending. Children know pretending. They know it before they know anything else because their survival depends on reading the adults around them accurately, and pretending is the primary threat to accurate reading. A child held by someone who is pretending to love them reads the pretending even when they cannot name it. And a child held by someone who is telling them the truth, even in a language they cannot yet process, reads the truth even when they cannot name that either. I was not pretending, I was doing the most serious work of my life. Augusta Carver came to the nursery twice a day, morning and evening. She came with the regularity of someone fulfilling an obligation rather than the irregularity of someone following desire. And she spent 20 minutes each visit holding William and looking at him with the expression of a woman who understood that this was what mothers did, and who was performing the understanding with genuine effort, if not genuine instinct. I watched her during these visits from the corner of the nursery, where I sat with the mending or the folding or whatever legitimate task I had arranged to be doing. I watched her, and I noted what she brought to her son, and what she did not bring, and the gap between what she brought and what I brought in the hours she was not there was the gap I was working in. It was a very large gap. Edmund Carver came to the nursery less often. He was a man whose relationship with his children was organized around their future usefulness to him rather than their present existence, and the present existence of a child too young to discuss tobacco prices or social connections was not something that engaged him. He came on Sundays briefly and looked at his son with the assessment of someone checking on an investment's development and left. William Carver's parents were present for perhaps 3 hours a day. I was present for 21. In 21 hours a day across the first 2 years of a child's life, you are not their nurse, you are their world. Charlotte came next. She was born in 1850 when William was 2, and she came to me at 4 weeks, and by the time she came I had refined what I was doing with William into something more specific. I had learned, across 2 years of close observation, what worked and what needed adjustment, what the particular texture of William's attention was and what it responded to, and how to give him what I was giving him in the forms that he could most completely receive. With Charlotte, I started more deliberately. Charlotte was, from the beginning, a child of extraordinary receptivity. She absorbed everything. She watched the faces around her with an intensity that the Carver family described as serious and that I understood as perceptive. She was going to see everything regardless of what I did or did not do. What I could do was ensure that what she saw was not distorted by the comfortable interpretations that the adults around her would otherwise supply. I told Charlotte the truth about her house, not in words for the first year, in everything else, in the way I held her differently than I held the Carver adults' expectations of her, in the way I spoke to her with the directness that I reserved for her and did not perform in the presence of her parents, in the things I let her see and the things I ensured she saw when opportunities presented themselves, which, in a house where the person considered furniture can arrange what the furniture is near without anyone noticing, presented themselves regularly. I let her see at 8 months old the face of a woman in the kitchen named Dorcas after Edmund Carver had spoken to Dorcas in the tone he used for the people he owned, the face that Dorcas made when Edmund Carver's back was turned, the face that contained everything a person contains when they have been spoken to as if they are not a person and are performing the compliance that survival requires while their actual response lives somewhere else. Charlotte saw that face. She was 8 months old. I watched her see it, and I watched her face process it with the complete seriousness of a child who has not yet learned what to do with information that contradicts what she is being told by the world she lives in, which means she filed it in the place where accurate information lives, which is deeper and more permanent than the place where comfortable information lives. She filed it and she kept it. I watched her keep it across the years that followed. The third child was Edmund Jr., called Ned, born in 1852. Ned was different from William and Charlotte in the way that each of the Carver children was different, which was significantly because the Carver children were people, and people are different from each other even when they come from the same parents and the same house. Ned was a physical child, more interested in moving through the world than in observing it, less naturally given to the kind of interior processing that Charlotte performed almost constantly. He required a different approach. With Ned, I worked through stories. I was a woman who had been listening to stories her entire life. The particular stories that enslaved people told each other and told their children, the stories that carried inside them the knowledge and the values and the history that the world around them was designed to prevent them from having. I knew how stories worked. I knew that a story received in the body, in the way that physical children receive things, travels differently through a person than a story received in the mind, and arrives in different places and stays in different ways. I told Ned stories. Not the stories that nursemaids told planter children, the stories that confirmed the comfortable version of the world. I told him other stories, stories about people who did things, stories about people who were told they could not do things and did them anyway. Stories that I constructed carefully to carry inside them the particular emotional content I was transmitting to each child in the form appropriate to that child. Ned listened to stories with the complete physical attention of a child who is hearing something true. He did not know at 3 and 4 and 5 years old what the stories were doing. I knew. The fourth child was Margaret, born in 1854. Margaret was the one who frightened me the most, not because of who she was, but because of who she was becoming under the influence of her mother, who had developed, by the time Margaret was born, a particular investment in her eldest daughter Charlotte's refinement, and a particular anxiety about whether Charlotte's seriousness was appropriate in a girl who would need to make a good marriage, and whether my influence on Charlotte's character had produced something that would be an asset or a complication. Augusta Carver was beginning to notice something. She could not have said what exactly. She was not a woman of significant insight into her own domestic life, but she was a woman of significant social intelligence, and social intelligence is a form of pattern recognition, and the pattern she was beginning to recognize in Charlotte at age 4 was a pattern that did not conform to what Charlotte was supposed to be. Charlotte asked questions. Not many. Charlotte was a careful child, and she had absorbed from me, without my ever articulating it, the understanding that asking the wrong question in the wrong place was expensive. But the questions she did ask were the questions that a child asks when they have been seeing things clearly for 4 years and want to understand the gap between what they see and what they are told. Augusta brought this to my attention in the spring of 1854 when Charlotte was 4 years old, in the careful language of a woman who is not certain what she is concerned about, but is concerned. She said that Charlotte seemed to have some unusual ideas about the people in the house, about the servants. She used that word, servants. She said Charlotte had asked her why Dorcas could not sit at the table when Charlotte was eating her breakfast, and that the question had struck her as the kind of question that a child did not arrive at independently. I said that children noticed things and asked about them, and that I would speak to Charlotte about appropriate questions. Augusta Carver accepted this and went back to her mourning. I went to Charlotte, and I said nothing about appropriate questions. I continued doing what I had been doing. With Margaret, I began earlier and more carefully because Augusta's attention had sharpened, and I needed to be more precise about what was visible and what was not. What was visible was a devoted nurse who sang to her children and told them stories and kept them healthy and responded to their needs with consistency and warmth. What was not visible was the content of what I sang and the content of what I told them, and the specific emotional world I was building in each of them that no one watching from the outside could see or measure or intervene in. The fifth child was James, born in 1856. By the time James came, I had been doing this for 6 years, and I had refined the practice to the point where it operated with the efficiency of something that has been performed so many times, it no longer requires conscious planning. I knew each child and what they needed and what form the truth took for each of them and how to give it to them in that form. I knew what the Carver family was telling them, and I knew exactly where the gaps were between what the family was telling them and what was true, and I filled each gap with the appropriate material for the child whose gap it was. James was the easiest and the hardest. He was the easiest because he was the most naturally open of all the Carver children, a child whose personality was organized around connection rather than analysis, who felt things more readily than he thought them, and who therefore received what I was giving him in the most direct and least mediated way. He was the hardest because his openness made him vulnerable to the comfortable version of the world that his family was offering him, as well as to the true version I was offering, and managing which one he received more completely required the most careful attention of any of the children. I spent extra hours with James. The sixth child was Catherine, born in 1859. Catherine was the last because Augusta Carver's health after Catherine's birth did not recover in the way that the doctors hoped, and though she lived for many more years, she did not have more children. Catherine was born into a nursery that already contained William at 11, Charlotte at 9, Ned at 7, Margaret at 5, and James at 3, which meant that Catherine was born into an environment shaped by 5 older siblings who had all been raised by the same woman with the same consistent practice across 11 years. What Catherine was born into was a culture. Not the culture of the Carver family, which was the culture of prosperous Richmond tobacco money, with its social obligations and its careful maintenance of the version of itself that the city's elite required. Catherine was born into the culture of the nursery, which was the culture I had built across 11 years with 5 children, a culture whose values and emotional textures and ways of seeing had been established long before she arrived, and that she absorbed from her siblings as naturally as she absorbed it from me. She was immersed from birth. I want to tell you about a specific evening in the spring of 1861 when William was 13 years old and Charlotte was 11, because this evening is the clearest evidence I have of whether what I had been doing for 11 years had produced what I intended it to produce. Edmund Carver had guests for dinner. This was not unusual. Edmund Carver entertained regularly, the social maintenance of a man whose business depended on relationships with other men of property and position in Richmond. The guests that evening were 3 other tobacco merchants and their wives, and the conversation at table, which I could hear from the hallway where I was overseeing the serving, turned at some point to the question of the slaves on a neighboring property who had made an attempt to run and had been caught and brought back. Edmund Carver expressed his opinion of this attempt with the clarity and certainty of a man who had never doubted his own position on any question connected to the ownership of people. He said that the attempt confirmed what he had always believed, that enslaved people who were properly managed and properly cared for did not run, that running was the product of poor management and inappropriate leniency, and the failure to maintain the appropriate relationship between owner and owned, and that a man who kept his affairs in proper order had nothing to fear from the people in his charge. The table agreed with the particular agreement of people who need to believe something and find a confident voice saying it reassuring. I was in the hallway. William was at the foot of the stairs. He had come down for water, which was his frequent excuse for being near the rooms where adult conversations happened, a habit I had not discouraged because I understood why he did it and what he was doing with what he heard. He was 13 years old, and he was doing what I had spent 11 years preparing him to do. He was listening. He listened to his father's speech about proper management and appropriate leniency and the appropriate relationship between owner and owned, and I watched his face from the hallway doorway, and what I saw on his face was what I had been working toward for 11 years. Not anger, not the hot immediate emotion that fades, something colder and more permanent. Recognition. The specific recognition of a person who is hearing something described in a way that is designed to make it sound reasonable and who can see, clearly and without effort, everything that the reasonable description is leaving out. He heard his father explain slavery, and he saw it for what it was. He went back upstairs with his water, and I went back to overseeing the serving, and nothing visible had changed. Everything had changed. The war came to Richmond in ways that were not gradual, that remade the city around the Carver House on Grey Street in the years between 1861 and 1865 with a speed and a totality that no one in that house had been prepared for. Edmund Carver's tobacco business was disrupted by the blockade, and then further disrupted by the military occupation of the city, and then further still by the end of the system that had made it profitable, the end that came in April of 1865, when the Confederacy collapsed and Richmond fell, and the people who had been owned in that city and in that state and in all the states that had organized themselves around owning them were no longer owned. I was free on a Tuesday in April of 1865. I stood in the street outside the Carver House on Grace Street, and I felt the word free settle onto me, and I took its weight and I breathed, and I thought about Samuel, about the 4 months, about Thomas, who had died of a fever of his own in 1857 and who I had not stopped carrying since, about 6 children in a nursery on Grace Street who were now 13, 11, 9, 7, 5 and 2 years old, and who had been raised for 11 years by a woman who had decided what to do with the access she had been given. William Carver was 20 years old when the war ended. He had not fought in the Confederate Army, despite the social pressure that Richmond had applied to young men of his class and position. He had found reasons not to, reasons his father had found inadequate, and his mother had found distressing, and that William himself had explained when pressed, in language that neither parent fully understood. He said the war was for something he could not support. He said this without further elaboration that would have been safe to offer in Richmond in 1863, but the lack of elaboration was not the same as a lack of understanding, and his father's face when he said it suggested that Edmund Carver heard something in it that he did not want to examine too closely. Charlotte Carver was 18 when the war ended. She had become, across the years I had watched her, exactly what the 8-month-old who had seen Dorcas's face had suggested she might become, a woman of extraordinary clarity about the world she lived in. She had married no one, which was unusual for a woman of her class and age in Richmond in that era, and had given no satisfactory explanation for this to her mother, and had continued in the Carver house through the war years, with the particular self-containment of someone who is waiting for something and knows what they are waiting for. Ned Carver was 16 when the war ended. He had grown into a young man whose physical energy had been directed, across the previous 4 years, into the particular kind of activity that physical young men in times of social upheaval direct their energy into when they have been given, through years of story and emotional transmission, a framework for understanding what the upheaval is about and who it is for. He had been helping people. Specifically, he had been one of several young white people in Richmond who had been moving food and information, and occasionally people through the city during the war years in ways that supported the city's black community against the Confederate authority that claimed to govern it. He had been doing this at significant personal risk and with the specific kind of determination that does not require external motivation, because the motivation is internal and has been internal since before the person doing the thing was old enough to fully articulate why. I knew about it. I had known about it for 2 years. I had said nothing to anyone. I had continued doing my work. Margaret Carver was 14 when the war ended. James was 11. Catherine was 6. What they would become was still becoming when I left the Carver house. But what they had been given, in 11 years of the nursery on Grace Street, was a foundation. Not a comfortable foundation, a true one. The difference between those two things is everything. A comfortable foundation tells you the world is what you have been told it is and gives you no tools for the moment when the world reveals itself as something else. A true foundation tells you the world is what it is and gives you the tools to see it clearly and to decide, from that clear seeing, what you are going to do. I gave them the tools. What they did with them was their own. I left the Carver house in the autumn of 1865 and went to find the community that had been building in Richmond's free black neighborhoods, the community that was constructing, in the immediate aftermath of the war's end, the institutions that freedom required: schools, churches, mutual aid organizations, the careful and urgent architecture of a people who had been denied the right to build for 250 years and who were building now with the particular intensity of people who understood that the time available for building might not be long. I helped build. It was the work I knew, the work of shaping what young people became, the work of giving children the tools to see the world clearly and to decide from that seeing what they would do. I did it in a school in Richmond's 3rd Ward for 14 years, teaching children whose parents had been enslaved the reading and the arithmetic and the history and the way of seeing that I had been giving the Carver children in the nursery on Grace Street, openly now, without the deniability, without the careful invisibility, in full daylight with my full name on the door. It was the best work of my life. William Carver left Richmond in 1867 for Boston, where he read law and became a lawyer who spent his career in the legal mechanisms that the Reconstruction period produced, the mechanisms designed to extend the protections of citizenship to the people who had been denied them. I heard about this through the networks that connected people who had been in the Carver house, and people who had left it, and people who moved through Richmond's communities across the years. Charlotte Carver stayed in Richmond and married in 1869, not to any of the men her mother had hoped for, but to a teacher from Philadelphia who had come south to work in the new schools for freed people. She taught in those schools herself for 30 years. Her mother never fully recovered from the marriage. Charlotte never fully cared that she had not. Ned Carver died in 1868 of a fever. He was 23 years old. I grieved him as I grieved Samuel, which is to say, completely and without apology, for the completeness, because he had been in my arms at 6 weeks old, and I had watched him become the person he became, and the person he became was worth grieving. What became of Margaret and James and Catherine I knew less completely, the threads of information that reached me across the years being thinner for the younger children who had grown up after I was paying less direct attention to them. What I knew was that the Carver family, as a social unit, did not cohere in the years after the war in the way that families of their class and position usually cohered. That the children did not share their parents' understanding of the world and did not pretend to share it with the completeness that social harmony in that context required. That Edmund Carver, in his later years, found his children collectively puzzling in a way that he could not account for and that none of his children offered to account for. He had raised them in a house where the woman in the corner was paying attention. He had not known the woman in the corner was paying attention. He had not looked. I have thought across the years about what I did, and whether it was what I intended it to be, and whether it produced what I wanted it to produce, and whether the production was worth the cost, which was 23 years of my life, in a house on Grace Street in Richmond, where I was never free, where I fed 6 children who were not my children with the milk my body produced for a child who was my child and who died at 4 months old. Samuel, the foundation of everything. When he died, and Augusta Carver came to tell me I was needed in the nursery, she was giving me something that she did not know she was giving me. She was giving me 11 years of access to the most formative period of 6 human beings' lives. She was giving me the nursery and the 21 hours a day, and the intimate influence that comes from being the person who holds children when they are new and frightened and forming their first understanding of what the world is and whether it can be trusted. She was giving me the children. She did not know she was giving me the children. I took them, and I raised them with everything I had, with Samuel in my arms and Thomas's voice in my memory, and my mother's face and my grandmother's stories and the complete accumulated knowledge of a woman who had been paying attention for 23 years to everything that the people around her assumed she was not paying attention to. I raised them to see, and they saw. That is the whole of it. That is what I did, and why I did it, and what it cost, and what it produced. The woman they assigned to the nursery was not the woman they thought they were assigning. The work they gave her was not the work she did. The children they put in her arms came back to them different from the children they had imagined raising, different in ways they could feel but not locate, different in the particular and permanent way that comes from having been told the truth at the beginning, before the lies had time to settle. I am Naomi. I fed 6 of their children with my body. I fed them with everything else I had too, and what I had was enough.
This is the story of Naomi, an enslaved wet nurse and nursemaid in the household of Edmund Carver on Grace Street in Richmond, Virginia, who served the Carver family for 23 years, beginning in 1842. No official record documents what Naomi did in the Carver nursery across 11 years and 6 children. What official records do document is the subsequent lives of the Carver children, which diverged from the expected trajectories of children of their class and position in ways that Richmond society noted without explaining. William Carver's legal career in Boston on behalf of Reconstruction-era civil rights cases was documented in the Boston legal press of the 1870s and 80s. Charlotte Carver's marriage to a Philadelphia educator and her 30 years of teaching in Richmond schools for freed people was documented in the records of the Richmond School Board. Naomi's own 14 years of teaching in Richmond's Third Ward School were documented in those same records, her name appearing on the school's annual reports from 1866 to 1880. She died in Richmond in 1883. Her grave is in the churchyard of the First African Baptist Church, which was the oldest black church in Richmond, and which was, in the years after the war, one of the institutions that Naomi helped build. The stone her congregation placed on her grave reads, in full, Naomi. She raised us well. The U.S. on that stone refers to the congregation. It may also refer to other children. The people who placed the stone knew what they meant. They left it open enough that anyone reading it could decide for themselves. If Naomi's story moves in you, the recognition of a woman who understood that the most powerful thing she could shape was not the present, but the future, and that the future lived in the children she was given, and what she gave them in return. Subscribe now, and join a community that refuses to let these voices be forgotten. These are the stories of the women who were handed other people's children, and who raised those children to see the world as it was, rather than as the people who handed them over needed it to appear. Leave a comment. Tell us where you are watching from. Tell us what Naomi means to you. Because the nursery on Grace Street in Richmond, Virginia is where this story lived for 11 years. In the 21 hours a day that belonged to a woman whose name was not on any document that mattered to the people who owned her. And what lived in those hours, in the arms of a woman who had lost her own son and been given 6 children who were not hers, was something that no one watching from the outside could see, and no one watching from the outside could stop. The truth, told quietly, told completely, told to children young enough to receive it before the comfortable lies had arrived. Told by a woman with enough patience and enough love and enough grief and enough purpose to tell it for 11 years without stopping. That is what Naomi did. That is who she was. And the children she raised carried it forward into a world that needed desperately what she had given them.